Welcome everybody to another teachingamericanhistory.org Saturday webinar sponsored by the Ashbrook Center at Ashland University. TAH.org is the leading online resource for the documents-based study of American history, government, and civics for teachers, students, and citizens. I'm Chris Burkett. I teach here at Ashland University, and I'm co-director of the Ashbrook Scholar Program for undergraduate students here. The theme of our webinar series this year is Great American Debates, and in case you happen to be joining us for the first time, our purpose is to pull together some thoughtful scholars and have a conversation about some great debates in U.S. history, and drawing on some documents that are included in our document database on TAH as well. And we encourage all of you joining us to participate in that conversation by submitting questions in the chat box. We'll try to get to as many of those as possible, and I encourage our scholars joining us today as well. If you see a question come up in the chat box, feel free to, and you want to tackle it, please feel free to go right for it. You don't have to wait for me to bring it up. But if you do submit a question, please submit it in the chat box, and make sure that you send it to all participants, not just me privately. So send it to everybody so we can all take a look at the question. So today's debate is Frederick Douglass versus William Lloyd Garrison, and we're very honored to have two very thoughtful gentlemen with us today, Peter Myers of the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire, and Lucas Morell of Washington and Lee University. Thanks to both of you for joining us this morning.
Glad to be here.
My pleasure.
Really appreciate it. So, the title of our debate today is Frederick Douglass versus William Lloyd Garrison. So since it's versus, obviously there's a disagreement there somehow, right? So, and I'm sure we'll get into what the disagreement is. But I thought maybe, if you don't mind, one or both of you could talk a little bit about the fact that they were friends. My understanding is they were friends and fellow abolitionists. And maybe we can start by talking about what they agreed on before we get into the details of what they disagreed on. Would either of you care to talk just a little bit about how they came to know each other, how they were associated with each other as abolitionists, and then we can start to see where and why they started to disagree.
Lucas, you want to take that, or you want me to?
Okay, tell you what, I'll start and then Pete correct me.
We'll wind up saying more or less the same things anyway, I'm expecting. Yeah.
But given that you've actually written a book on the subject, and I only pretend to know a little bit about Douglass because I only write articles, I'll start and Pete can fill in the spaces and correct my problems. Douglass came under the tutelage of William Lloyd Garrison after hearing a speech of Garrison's or reading an editorial, I forget which, and essentially was trained to be an abolitionist speaker the way Garrison was. Early on, of course, I should state the obvious. We should begin with the fact that Frederick Douglass is an escaped slave, so he is an outlaw according to the slave law of Maryland, from which he escaped, and according to the Fugitive Slave Act of the United States at the time, dated back all the way to 1793, he did not live freely with the protection of the law of any state or federal government. And so going on the abolitionist speaking tour with Garrison and speaking about the horribleness of slavery, and in some detail, but not perfect detail, explaining how he escaped, he was really risking his life by being open to apprehension. And he learned from Garrison that the key way to get rid of slavery was not through force, but through words. This was known as moral suasion. In other words, that the way you get abolition, and we're both, of course, in favor of abolition. Here, Douglass was, of course, preaching what he had already practiced. The way you get abolition ultimately is by persuading the man-stealers, the slaveholders, to be convicted of the sin, the crime of slavery, and then to stop stealing, to manumit their slaves. And this was known as moral suasion. In other words, the use of words to persuade, exhort, excoriate, and even condemn not only the institution of slavery, but those who practiced it. Douglas did this so well, unfortunately, that when his master found out about him, he tried to get him back. So Douglas had to flee the country for a few years. He fled to the United Kingdom, where he gave speeches there, and he was only he only chose to return after his freedom was purchased for him by friends abroad as well as at home, including a widow's mite from William Lloyd Garrison, who did so, as far as I can understand, grudgingly. It's not that he didn't want Douglas to be free, but he didn't like the fact that to get him free, he had to be turned into an article of merchandise. Douglas himself writes that he would not contribute one penny to what God had gave him already, but he did not begrudge those who helped him legally become a free man. And so, as I say, until about 4950, Douglas preaches essentially the same line as William Lloyd Garrison, that the only legitimate way to achieve freedom from slavery is through peaceful means. You cannot coerce or compel righteousness. Garrison had a pretty high bar, which Douglas, for the most part, was trying to meet as well, in terms of how that righteousness was to be accomplished. In other words, it was not to be accomplished with some sanction. Do this or you get punished or fined. Righteousness comes from inside, not from outside. And as I said, that's a pretty high bar to try to accomplish something that ultimately we'll see Douglas decides you need to do by way of law and the Constitution. So how's that for a start? And Pete, I'll let you fill in some of the things I left out.
That's a really good start. Yeah, a couple of things I would add. I would add a thing or two on the backstory about Douglas and Garrison, and then expand a bit on what they agreed on, and then and there's something in that that's kind of interesting that maybe has bigger or more extended significance. But let me get to the backstory first. Douglas tells about this in his autobiographies, that he initially heard about abolitionists through whisperings and mutterings of members of the slaveholding class, including his own master, and he kind of strained to pick up what they were talking about, but he got enough of it to figure out that abolitionism was something that they feared and loathed, and that made it appealing to him. So he's already got kind of a fascination with these abolitionists even before he escapes. So now let's go to the period immediately after he escapes. He's working, he winds up in Bedford, Massachusetts, and he works as a day laborer pretty much happily. He's very happy to be paid for his own labor. He's supporting a family. This is 1838 to 1841. But all the while, he's also attending abolition meetings, and actually local ones, and actually occasionally speaking on them, at them. And he's reading The Liberator, which he described as his nourishment at that time. And so his involvement with the abolitionists leads him to attend this convention in Nantucket. I think it was a New England it would have been either New England or Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society convention in probably New England in Nantucket. This is in 1841. And so he's just in the audience, and he's listening to speakers, and someone recognizes him and has heard him in one of his church abolition oratories, probably, and invites him to speak at that convention. And he describes it as a very fearful thing, that he's full of trepidation, speaking to this audience. I think maybe this is the first time in his life he's spoken to an audience of white people. and so he gives this impromptu speech about more or less impromptu about slavery. Garrison's in the audience, and Garrison is just amazed, enthralled by what Douglas has to say, and pretty much immediately invites him to become, to join the group of Garrisonian itinerant lecturers about slavery. And Douglas is a little hesitant immediately, but he agrees to do that, and that's what launches his career. So let's say something bigger about his initial sympathy for Garrison. It isn't simply that Garrison was anti-slavery, though that's obviously the main part of it. Garrison was, in his way, one cautions oneself not to say too much of this in the Trump era, but Garrison was had a kind of anti-American spirit. I mean, Garrison had an antinomian, almost anti-political spirit as well. And so that's not too terribly surprising, but Douglas found that initially appealing. There's a famous editorial in which, this is a little bit later in the 1840s, in which Douglas asks, what country do I have? What country have I? Are his words. And in a letter to Garrison, I think this was written in the time that Lucas mentioned when he was in the British Isles. He says to Garrison, "I have no patriotism. My patriotism's been whipped out of me." And that's how he answered the question, "What country have I?" He says, "I have no country. America is not my country." And so, which is understandable. I mean, first of all, Douglas is a young man. He's an angry young man. He's full of a sense of the injustice of the country toward people like him. And so he's sympathetic to Garrison's. There's a kind of natural inclination to be sympathetic to the disunion strategy, the anti-constitution strategy. It's more than a strategy, principle really, that Garrison held. And so I think that's a big thing to think of and always to keep in mind about Douglas, that Douglas became, in a way, a great American patriot. And that patriotism was not natural to him. That was earned. That was hard earned by reflection on the character of the country, at least in prospect. One last thing in summary. Chris, you asked what they agree on. One of the distinctive things about Garrisonian abolitionism, as compared with the kind of anti-slavery sentiment that prevailed during the founding era and the first maybe few decades of America's national life, was that the Garrisonians insisted on immediate abolition, that it was not to be gradual, it was not to be compensated. It had to be immediately affected, because every moment of slavery is a monstrous injustice. So they agreed about that. They agreed, as Lucas said, about the moral suasion, though I don't think Douglas was ever fully convinced that this should be the exclusive method. But there's again a story in his autobiography about that. The first book he ever read besides the Bible was an oratory collection called The Columbian Orator. And his favorite part of that book was a dialogue between a master and a slave, a fictitious dialogue between a master and a slave. It's kind of a simple little story in which the person who's enslaved essentially talks his master out of enslaving him. And Douglas found, who was obviously gifted with language, found something very appealing in that. So the moral suasion idea is appealing to him in that way. And finally, they originally agreed, though this is one of the big points of the break, they originally agreed on the pro-slavery character of the Constitution, mainly because Garrison was a kind of mentor to, Frederick Douglass. You got to consider, through this period in the 1840s, Frederick Douglass has never had any formal education. He's a very young man, still in his 20s in most of that decade. And so he was impressionable, and Garrison was almost a kind of father figure for a while, which made it all the more difficult when they, emotionally difficult for both of them when they parted ways. All right, that's enough out of
That's
me for
great.
now.
Well, there's so much good stuff in both of your introductory remarks here. First of all, just circling back a little bit, Lucas, I had no idea that Garrison actually contributed anything toward Douglas's freedom. From a man of such high principle, that had to have been one of the toughest things he'd ever done.
Yeah, Pete, you could check me on this, but I believe Garrison writes of this very briefly, and he confesses this, as I say, grudgingly. He recognizes that the mere fact that he contributes, as I put it, his widow's mite, is I mean, he recognizes that by purchasing his freedom, he's actually enabling the system by which human beings are commodified. Of course, it's for the sake of freedom, not for the enslavement of a person. But he does it. I mean, I'm sure he repented right after he did it,
Right.
whatever his sense of his maker was. Pete, can you add anything to that?
Well, not on the particular point, but I mean, I agree with all of that, and it seems to me, I mean, a couple of further points. It seems to me that that's characteristic of Garrison.
Sure.
You know, that Garrison was Garrison insisted on being so inflexibly principled about these kinds of issues that it got him into difficulties in circumstances in which some prudential judgment was required, and the Douglas liberation was certainly one of those, right? I mean, anybody's liberation would be one of those. You're dealing, okay, you've got a principle that says if I pay somebody for in exchange for liberation, then it's like paying a robber, to stop being a robber. And at the level of principle, that's of course quite right. That Garrison thought that if you do this, you're implicitly conveying a certain recognition of the character of slaves as property, and there's no such thing as human property except in the self-ownership sense, and
Right.
So you can't do that. But on the other hand, if you got an opportunity to liberate a flesh and blood human being, do you not take all the measures you can to do that? And I think the other point is kind of generalizing upon that. Garrison tended to equivocate on certain kinds of points, really just for this reason. When his principles butted up against what in some level he recognized as a more prudential judgment, he tended to get more equivocal. The thing I have in mind is, for instance, what he says about Nat Turner. That Garrison was, and John Brown later on, Garrison was a principled advocate of moral suasion, that he wanted this done by peaceful means. He wanted to convert people, to appeal to their heart, and absolutely rejected violence as a means of, including the force of law,
Yep.
as a means of liberating slaves. Okay, now that's a principled position. I sometimes I say to my class, was Garrison a kind of 19th century version of Martin Luther King Jr. in that respect, nonviolent direct action? But on the other hand, when he actually had to comment on acts of forceful rebellion, he tends to equivocate. He doesn't really criticize Nat Turner for doing what he does. He says, well, I can't support violence in principle, but what Nat Turner does is understandable and inevitable given the violence of slavery. And so, there's a certain equivocation in Garrison, I think, for these reasons.
That's very interesting. So we have a piece, I think, from Douglas. From Douglas. That I think is included in the documents and debates volume, if I remember correctly. Frederick Douglass justifying John Brown. Is that a point of divergence between them as well? I'm skipping ahead a little bit. Maybe we don't want to go there yet. But.
I'll say something brief about that. Lucas can add. At a certain level, maybe. My sense is that Douglas had much more to say about John Brown than did Garrison. Douglas had a more personal involvement with John Brown than did Garrison. Garrison met him. Garrison knew him some, but there's never a sense between Garrison and John Brown that they're going to work together. John Brown really wanted Frederick Douglass to work together with him, and Douglass was tempted. Douglass considered it, but he thought that. I mean, John Brown had two different plans, and one of them I think Douglass was pretty well on board with, the more moderate one. You know, the plan to take Harper's Ferry, and spread a slave rebellion, Douglass thought was something close to madness, and so he didn't sign on to that. But he did think that John Brown was a glorious martyr for the anti-slavery cause. He regarded John Brown as a kind of a vanguard, really a sort of a vanguard force in what became the Union Army, and he continued to extol John Brown, praise him to the skies for decades after the Civil War was over. So yeah, I mean, he compares John Brown. He gives a speech at the anniversary of Harper's Ferry. He gives a speech at Harper's Ferry, and he compares John Brown to Jesus. I mean, he really praises. I mean, when I say he praises him to the skies, I should say he praises him to the heavens. I mean, he never said much of anything bad about John Brown.
Wow.
Hey, Pete, is that the same speech where he says, "I could live for the slave, but John Brown could die for the slave"?
I believe so.
Somewhere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Because that's what was the great virtue of John Brown for him. That John Brown, Douglass said, "Look, I'm a black man advocating for black people, so I got a certain self-interest as well as a principle in this." John Brown is a white man, who was willing to give his life for people who are not like him, who don't identify with him, and that's very special. That was Douglass's view of it.
Let me quickly add to try to make it a little more balanced here, at least in terms of Garrison's foot in the water here. There is a piece that Garrison writes, and it may be on the Ashbrook website, and if it's not, I'm sure they could put one up pretty quickly. John Brown and the Principle of Non-Resistance. This is a speech or editorial that Brown writes in December of 1859. Yeah. And he says emphatically, on the one hand, he's a non-resistant. In other words, he would never, of course, aid or abet John Brown. Nevertheless, he likes the result. So he says, "I'm a non-resistant. I've labored unremittingly to effect, with an E, the peaceful abolition of slavery. Yet I am prepared to say, success to every slave insurrection at the South and in every slave country." He says, "Whenever commenced, I cannot but wish success to all slave insurrections." So on the one hand, he says, I can't lift a finger, and nor would I encourage anyone to actually use force to accomplish this righteous end. Nevertheless, if the ball gets rolling in that regard, I'm not going to get in the way, and in fact, I'm going to wish it Godspeed. So he wants to remain pure in his principles and at least give moral encouragement to the objective, if not to the means towards that objective. So I think you're right, Pete. It's an equivocal way of saying, it's kind of like crossing your fingers behind your back and saying, no, not even the slave should use force to free himself, but boy, I wish him well.
Yeah. No, I'm looking at that speech as I'm listening to you. I'll add a further quotation. Says Garrison, "Give me as a non-resistant." We should maybe explain that term in a second, but sure. "Give me as a non-resistant Bunker Hill and Lexington and Concord, rather than the cowardice and servility of a Southern slave plantation." He goes on, "We have been warmly sympathizing with John Brown all the way through, from the time of his arrest till now. Now he no longer needs our sympathy, for he is beyond suffering and wears the victor's crown." So in a way, Garrison says kind of what Douglass is going to say, that John Brown is a sort of, in an odd kind of way, he's a sort of a Jesus figure.
That's interesting. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead, Chris.
No, I was just going to say there's this interesting relationship. It seems like Garrison is really concerned with ends and means, right? And he famously says in one of the speeches that we recommended today, part of his condemnation of the founding and the compromises in the Constitution is that though they thought the end may have been good, that of establishing a union, that end doesn't justify means. In the example of paying or contributing to Douglas's freedom, the end may have been good, but he had the means of contributing, and for the reasons you mentioned, seemed to be unjust to him as well. And in this case with John Brown, though the end may have been good, he had some qualms with the means as well. So he really wants to be just as much as possible, or justified as much as possible in both ends and means, which again sets a pretty high moral standard, as you both have said already. So my question from this is was this a result of Garrison's religious background? I don't know much about Garrison's religious views.
Yeah, in part. I'll say something brief, and then I'll let Pete give us the more capacious response.
You're setting me up for a fall here.
Yeah, that's precisely what I'm doing. Garrison's Christianity is, shall we say, not quite conventional or orthodox, but I'll begin with an easy one. His pacifism, I think, can legitimately be expressed as Christian pacifism. At least he understood it that way. He did not believe, to borrow from the Gospels, he did not believe that good fruit can come from an evil tree. And so in that sense, Chris, to your point about means and ends, he did not think that you could achieve a truly righteous result from means that were at all, and I mean at all, tainted. And that was the great rub, or the great obstacle for him. I think it was Diana Schott who brought up a quote, and I'm not sure where it's from, but she mentioned that among the pacifists, one of the slogans was, "We would not strike Satan even to kill him." Imagine if you had, I mean, this is like The Ring and throwing it in Mordor to try to bounce around from the Bible to Tolkien, but even if you had the opportunity to get rid of the originator of evil, the pacifists claimed, no, we could not even use force to do that. So that's putting a very fine point on it. But that's essentially the principle that drove Garrison. Now, I'll let Pete describe what was his reading of the Bible on these things, and how did he apply it to abolitionism as he understood it.
Yeah, I can't improve on that. I mean, if Lucas knows more about the religious background and significance of these things than I do. The non-resistance idea was based on a certain reading of the Bible. Resist ye, not evil.
Yeah.
In a way, really, it's an interpretation of the turn the other cheek doctrine. And Garrison typically took it in a kind of inflexibly principled way, at least in his rhetoric. Why Garrison so insisted on quote unquote life according to principle, that's a little harder to know. It just seemed to be part of his temper, part of his intellectual makeup. But whatever the origin of it, that was the doctrine and it was. Well, yeah, I was going to read something, but I'll finish that thought at first. So the idea was that I think this ultimately is the moral thought that's animating Garrison, that slavery will be done and gone. It will be well and truly abolished when it is abolished in the hearts of all of the people supportive of it.
Mm-hmm.
And that means they have to be converted. And so there's almost, in a way, a kind of a Lockean point here from Locke's letter concerning toleration. I'm not saying that's a direct influence, but the idea being that, or Augustinian, you could say the same thing, early Augustine, that you can't beat people into conversion. You can't force them to believe something that they don't actually believe. At some level, there has to be a moral suasion in order really finally to take care of this problem. And so Garrison simply renounces all force, and the non-resistant position, reasoning out the logic of it, means a kind of, he didn't like the term, but it means a kind of anarchism. because you're resisting people you're resisting the idea that governments are necessary to make people behave themselves by the force of law. They have to be governed by their own conscience, and that's what he wants the outcome to be with regard to the slaveholders also. He didn't like the term anarchism because he insisted that he was a proponent of the government of God, that it's not simply human self-government, in a kind of radical libertarian way. So fair enough, but he does reject human government as a non-resistant. And so that's a kind of a bigger and more expansive reason as to why he rejects political means for abolition. It took him a little while to come to that conclusion. You can find things that Garrison said early on that support political action against abolition. But when he really reasons out, in his view, the implications of this non-resistance position, he becomes really, really thoroughly anti-political. That was the basis for the disunion position, just as much as his rejection of the Constitution was.
Yeah, I'll just direct our participants to the speech Declaration of Sentiments adopted by the Peace Convention. Focus on the word peace. By that he means pacifism, and in that. I'm not going to refer to it specifically, but in that you'll see his arguments against compulsion. You can't make people become righteous, as it were. This doesn't come as a result of a sanction or a threatened punishment. It really is a conversion, and you really get a globalist, if you will, perspective there. That's even not true, because he doesn't, as much as he thinks all human beings are made in the image of God and therefore deserve to be free and to live. He proclaims emphatically that they pledge no allegiance to any human government. That's where Pete is talking about, well, does that mean no rule, i.e. does that mean anarchy, without rule, without laws? Technically, yes, but that means these are people who are so thoroughly converted, as Pete put it, they don't need to be told by other human beings what to do. God, as they submit to his will be their ruler. And so there's a millenarian aspect to Garrison as well. They really are looking forward to the second coming of Christ in that respect, the only true Lord, the only true ruler of human beings, because as converts, they would be Lord, he would be Lord of their hearts, right? He would have so captured their will, if you will. They don't need human laws to tell them what's right from what's wrong. That's
very interesting. And we have a number of questions that have come in.
Oh, yes. Fire away.
So a quick one from John, and then I'd like to circle back to a question from Sam. John, on this point that I think you were just raising, Lucas, John asks if there's a relationship between Garrison's rhetoric, or maybe we can say his pacifism and the things you were just talking about, with the Second Great Awakening. This seem to be some parallels in the way.
I couldn't tell you, which came first. Was it the Awakening or Garrison? I'm not as good a historian, I suppose, as I should be on this question to know if he was part of that social movement. But he's certainly explicit, at least in that one statement, with regards to this very palpable sense that the social reform movements of the day, not just abolition, but temperance, penal reform, a number of the things that were also happening in England. Like, we kind of piggybacked on these social movements that were becoming political movements, even though, of course, Garrison doesn't want it to be a political movement. I don't think it's a coincidence that those things are happening at the same time.
Yeah. So maybe there was it'd be an interesting question to pursue, perhaps.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. I think it cannot be accidental that at the same time the Second Great Awakening arises, you get temperance movements, women's rights movements, socialism and communism in kind of localized ways, and also abolition. And by the way, I don't want to steer this in a different direction. Just a small tangent about that was that Frederick Douglass, encountered here and there the idea that there was an intricate connection between abolition and socialism. And Douglass thought that was a great confusion and a terrible idea to link the two. That in other words, the attack on the property of slavery and other human beings entailed somehow an attack on all property. It's sort of a version of what Garrison seems to think the attack on the U.S. government as currently constituted is really part of a broad attack on all human government. And there's a kind of utopianism that Douglass is uncomfortable with.
Yep, good distinction.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Sam points out almost all pacifists, advocates of nonviolent resistance, do claim that the violence of violent resistance against oppression is a lesser violence than the violence enforcing oppression. And he cites Gandhi. And so I'm just wondering, does Garrison's, we're circling back a little bit, but since we talked about his pacifism, does Garrison's pacifism agree with or deviate from that general sort of tradition of pacifism understood as nonviolent resistance?
Well, I was just going to say something briefly. I read that comment, and I think that's a fair point. That there certainly are these judgments, that there's a difference. Garrison has certainly a sympathy for Nat Turner that he does not have, say, for the likes of Edward Covey, But on the other hand, I'd stick with my word of equivocation. I think there is a certain, to say that it's a lesser violence is not the same thing as saying Godspeed to those who are taking up arms against slavery. I think that is a kind of equivocation when he takes this principled position of nonviolence. It's sort of similar to, although MLK doesn't go quite that far. What Martin Luther King Jr. will say about the rioters, about those who who are engaging in racial rioting, for some of them at least for protest reasons, in the 1950s. King deplores the method. He thinks it's going to have bad consequences, but there's a sense in which he thinks it's also justified.
Great. And then maybe one other quick question, and then we should turn to the disagreements between them and how those develop and what those disagreements actually are. But Jay asked about the colonization abolitionists. What were Garrison and Douglass's views on that, and did they agree on that?
You want to take that one, Lucas?
I'm trying to cite chapter and verse here, but so just take this one off the top of my head. Garrison famously, perhaps most famously, declares in his first editorial, he not only recants ever being a gradualist with regards to abolition. I don't remember if he brings up colonization, but I believe he had once favored colonization. But I please quickly refute that if you know for a fact that is not true. But I have.
No, that's correct. That's true.
This is very early on, and so right. Part of his mission to preach the true gospel of abolitionism, Garrison had to begin with repenting of public sins with regards to what he had tried to persuade other people to believe. Not only that slavery wasn't so bad that you couldn't do it in a more moderate, gradual way over time, but he was, like many abolitionists were, in favor of colonization as the most likely plan B on the emancipation front. You go back to the founding period with guys as famous as Thomas Jefferson, saying that we're entirely in favor of emancipation, but we do not see a peaceful coexistence of blacks and whites, and therefore the best thing to do is to twin emancipation with what he called expatriation, what we're calling colonization. In other words, we'll free them, but they must leave. We cannot have free blacks. We don't believe that free blacks would coexist peacefully with free whites, and therefore, for the sake of both, the blacks would need to go elsewhere. So that was an opinion that Garrison once held. I can't cite chapter and verse on it, but he quickly disabuses anyone of that notion and that support in his first editorial, at least insofar as gradualism, to be sure. But I can't cite the speech with regards to colonization right now.
Yeah, and that seems like a position that Douglas pretty consistently opposed.
Oh yeah, emphatically, Pete. That's a good grief. That's a softball, Pete. You can.
Yeah, that's a hanging curve. Yeah. Garrison and Douglas, in the maturity of Garrison's thinking, which comes pretty quickly, as Lucas says. I mean, by the time he even launches the Liberator, he's become convinced of the anti-colonization position. Yes. So he's really, he's born in 1805, so he's very young, early 20s when he's open to the idea of colonization. Douglas hated it all along, and the reasons, at least the one reason, main reason, is really simply this, that, well, I guess I can't say it simply, but the American Colonization Society is a kind of which was the society, organized by actually heavyweight politicians at the national level, who are anti-slavery, but they're moderates and gradualists. They're anti-slavery in the way that most anti-slavery people, members of the founding, especially the Southerners and the Republicans, as opposed to the Federalists, were. So the idea was that, again, that emancipation needs to be gradual, needs to be compensated, and it needs to be followed by colonization. And really, standing above all of those ideas is the idea that, for God's sakes, we want it to be peaceful, so it has to be voluntary. The slaveholders have to agree to do this. Well, the slaveholders are not going to agree to just surrender a very large portion of their wealth without compensation, and not only the slaveholders, but the whole of white society, especially but not exclusively in the South, really across the whole country, is uneasy with, uneasy is a very polite word, with the idea of integration. Douglas refers in a later speech, 1865 speech, he refers to this question, he says, that has bedeviled the anti-slavery movement from the beginning, and the question is, quote unquote, what shall we do with the Negro post-emancipation? He hated that question because he understood that question proceeded from the thought that integration, or civil and political equality between whites and blacks living side by side under the same law in the same society, is simply not possible. Either not possible or not desirable for the majority of whites, North and South. And so, to get back to the motives for the Colonization Society, the idea was, you got to find a way to make anti-slavery palatable to people, to people in positions of power, so that you can imagine legislators, who are elected by people uneasy with the influx of a free black population into their midst, are actually going to vote for this. And so, that's in a sense, that's the case for it. But the case against it is that, or at least a big part of it is, that if you say this, that emancipation becomes possible, abolition becomes possible, only when you have the promise of colonization as the aftermath of it. And you add to this the experiential premise that colonization is not going to happen. I mean, not mass colonization. The American Colonization Society succeeded in founding what's now the country of Liberia, and it succeeded in sending a few thousand people over the course of a few decades to Liberia. But that's a few thousand people out of, by the mid-19th century, millions of people who are enslaved Garrison's colleague Benjamin Lundy said at one point that colonization is like trying to bail out the ocean with a thimble. It's not going to happen. And so if you put those two things together, emancipation can only happen if you've got colonization. And you can't have colonization. Then the colonization argument becomes an argument for continuing slavery. And that's one way of expressing what both Garrison and Douglass hated about it. Another way of expressing what Douglass hated about it is the idea that that a free black person is just anathema to, especially to slaveholding society. So the support for colonization was kind of equivocal. You would say, I'm using that word a lot, I'm sorry, but in the North you could say this is a means to end slavery. In the South you could say this is a means to rid yourself of a troublesome population of free blacks. And Douglass hated that implication of it also.
Wow.
I found this site. I'll just say this real quickly. I'm glad Pete brought up the American Colonization Society because Garrison actually gave a speech to them. But look at how far back it is. 1829, July 4th, 1829. He gives this speech, and just a few quick points that he was arguing in this speech. He says, I call upon our citizens to assist in establishing auxiliary colonization societies in every state, county, and town. He wants Congress at this point in time to colonize, quote, the colored population of the states, etc. So there was a time in the deep past of Garrison where he actually was a supporter of colonization. But again, by the time of his first editorial, for when he becomes really the beginning of the popularity, is probably the most well-known abolitionist in the country. When he publishes The Liberator, he has repented of that sin and the sin of gradualism. So that's July 4th, 1829, address to the American Colonization Society.
It's fascinating. So this is really interesting. So then, given Douglas's consistent opposition to colonization for the reasons that Pete was just talking about, it recalls a statement, or I think Lucas, you pointed this out earlier, that there was a sort of a turning point for Douglass with regard to what I think you referred to earlier as his patriotism. That is, as Douglass said famously, I have no country. You might think that if that was true, then Douglass might have been inclined toward colonization or leaving this country. But as you pointed out, there's a turning point for him, right, where he comes around and starts, at least in his rhetoric, thinking out loud about the possibility in the future after emancipation of black Americans and white Americans living together peacefully. And in his rhetoric, he talks about, well, there's a more, just using this term a little bit loosely, there's a deeper kind of patriotism that reveals itself. Despite the flaws of his country, his patriotism seems to reveal itself in a hope of sorts for his country in the future.
Yeah.
So,
well, the great pivot, of course, is his change of mind with regards to the nature of the Constitution, as Pete hinted earlier. Right. He shifts from that 1848 or 48 speech, the right to criticize American institutions, where he says, "What country have I?" I have no country. This country doesn't recognize me, etc. I can't have patriotism if I don't have a country. But by the time 1852 rolls around, and by the way, 1852 is after the second Fugitive Slave Act is passed. After the Fugitive Slave Act is revised where they put more teeth into that legal federal bite in terms of the return of fugitive slaves to their putative owners. Douglass, at that point in time, decides, you know what? The Constitution is pro-liberty. It is not pro-slavery. And that is the biggest, I don't know, at least politically, the biggest break that he makes with Garrison, because Garrison does not believe that. He believes, as he famously put it, it's a covenant with death and an agreement with hell. You always knew where you stood with Garrison. He put that right out there. Douglass thinks that the Constitution is the premier lever by which slavery will be destroyed. If we allow the Constitution to fall apart, in other words, if we let, as Garrison wanted, our erring sisters go, Douglas says, does that make it easier or harder for us to emancipate slaves? Does that absolve us of responsibility? Absolutely not. And the best place to look for this, at least on this technical question of the Constitution as a lever for slavery or for emancipation, is the speech on the Dred Scott decision in 1857.
Right.
And I'm just going to make one point and then let Pete take over, as I am wont to do. Douglas says, I know of no soil better adapted to the growth of reform than American soil for the development of right ideas of liberty and humanity. So here is someone who recognizes the problems of American slavery, right? It's transpiring and has certain strong safeguards and protections within the American Union. And yet he says the best solution for this problem, the best remedy is to be found within, not from without. And that is a frontal assault on Garrison's opinion about the Constitution. So over to you, Pete.
Okay. Yeah, there's a lot to say about this, Chris. That's a really good question. That's a very interesting and very important question. I'm gonna start just by coming back to your question. If later 1840s Douglas says, "Well, I have no country," I mean, and he says that for reasons that are built upon a logic. You know, I'm outside the law. I have, as you know, I've been until very recently a fugitive. And most of the people who are like me, who look like me, you know, have no legal protection. Well, if you don't have any legal protection, it's a little hard to have a firm sense of allegiance to the country that you're in. And so you're right. It would seem like a natural inference from that would be support for colonization. Here, let me introduce a distinction. The colonization movement is, I mean, you know, back to Douglas's hatred of it for just a second. The colonization movement is a movement created by white men for, you know, the object of which is to get rid of free black people in the U.S. So, you know, when you put it in those terms, it's easy to see why Douglas hated that. But let's distinguish colonization from emigration, because there was an emigrationist movement that never commanded the allegiance of anywhere near a majority of blacks, but it did have support in the black community in the later 1840s, and especially after really much more support after the Fugitive Slave Law was passed in 1850. Here, an honorable mention goes to Douglas's one-time colleague Martin Delany, who wrote a book in 1852. Same year, Douglas gives his most important speech. Delany writes this book advocating that that blacks should emigrate. You know, that things are hopeless for us here. We're outside the protections of law. White Americans glorify their own revolutionary fathers, but their ancestors were immigrants and they did something glorious. We can do, and we should do the same thing. So Delany is making this argument. Delany was briefly Douglas's co-editor in his paper, The North Star, and they came to have disagreement essentially on this point. And so they parted ways, but they were kind of friendly rivals for decades thereafter. Okay, so Douglas has to. So there is one point of saying that is to say that there is a non-racist alternative to colonization that Douglas could have embraced. He could have been like Delany. And if you read just the first, few pages of the 4th of July speech, you could easily get the impression that's, well, maybe the first half of the speech or so. You could easily get the impression that's the position he's taking when he starts out by addressing his audience. Okay, what's the meaning of the 4th of July? And he goes, and there's this blizzard of second-person pronouns. This is your holiday. These are your fathers. This is your occasion. Your country, not mine, right? It seems to be the same thing. But then at the end, he says, no, I'm an American, and the Constitution's a glorious liberty document, and there are grounds for hopefulness. So this is kind of what I had in mind when I was saying that Douglas's patriotism is a striking thing, is a kind of a surprising thing, and it's an achievement. One last thought about this. I mean, Lucas was calling attention to that it seems almost shocking that Douglas gives this 4th of July oration professing what's clearly a deep and heartfelt American patriotism 2 years after the fugitive slave law. You know, the legislature of the land has enacted the most pro-slavery law in the history of American politics. And I would suggest that is striking in a way, but it's not accidental. It's logical in a way also. I mean, one of the things that taught Douglas was that, first of all, the slave power, quote unquote, is very powerful. It controls the national government, and the reason for that is that slaveholders are absolutely determined to maintain their institution. And so it teaches Douglas that Garrisonian moral suasion, the idea of remaining outside politics and corroding the support for slavery merely by challenging rhetoric, is simply not going to work. He says the slaveholders are deadly in earnest. He's convinced by John Brown, in other words, that slavery is going to have to be abolished when it's abolished by force. And so at the same time, Douglas becomes more militant. You'll find editorials in this period of Douglas advocating acts of disobedience to the enforcement of the fugitive slave law. There's an editorial, Lucas knows this very well, that has the arresting title, "Is it right and wise to kill a kidnapper?" And Douglas's answer to those questions are yes and yes. And the kidnappers are those who would enforce the fugitive slave law, which was, again, he's not being merely rhetorical. That was a kind of legalized kidnapping, was what that law provided for. So Douglas is militant in advocating the resistance of law, and at the same time, he is much more political and patriotic, advocating abolition by the force of law than he had been before. And those two things are related in just the same way that Garrison's antinomianism was related to his anti-slavery also. We could say more about the Constitution, but I'll be quiet. I'll be quiet for the moment anyway.
Yeah, if I can just comment on that, I think that is exceedingly well put, Pete. And I would just summarize it by saying essentially what you're saying is that while it might be astonishing in one light, as you say, it's eminently logical for Douglas, given the thinking that he is doing, rethinking that he is doing about the Constitution around 1849, 1850. This Slave Act gets passed, as you say, it reflects public opinion, because that's what laws do. They reflect public opinion. And so, as you put it, so slave power, is it fair to say here that for Douglas, slave power has to be met with power, but that power, Douglas decides, is found in the Constitution. So power must be met with power, slave power met with legal, political power that he believes can be found in the Constitution. Mm-hmm. Like the Republicans are saying at the time, like Lincoln, saying that, all the federal government has power to do is to prevent the extension of slavery into the territories, which is a disputed point, of course, with Democrats. No, Douglas reads the Constitution to say Congress has it within their power under the Constitution, interpreted by this particular generation, to ban slavery wherever it exists on American soil.
Mm-hmm. Not only the power, it has the duty. Chris, can I intervene with just a quick question? How much time do we have?
Oh, we have about 15 minutes or so.
Okay, yeah. I had forgotten just how long our session goes. Sam, out among the listeners here, asked a question. Okay, yeah, that to me, that's a very good question, which is partly to say that's a difficult question. But I want to say a couple of things about that.
Pete, I'm not sure everybody can see the question, so.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I was going to say. I mean, to encapsulate the question, quickly, it is this: was Douglas's change of mind on the Constitution essentially instrumental? That is, did Douglas decide if we're going to wage an effective battle against slavery, we just have to have the Constitution on our side, so I have to reinterpret it? Or was he genuinely convinced that the Constitution is anti-slavery? Was he genuinely convinced the Garrisonians were wrong about that? Now, that's a very, very important question that's important to understand Douglas and Garrison and the pre-Civil War era. I think it's important to understand, constitutionalism in general too. This is a kind of the battle between legal realism, the Constitution is whatever the powerful say it is, versus originalism is kind of implicit here also. And I will suggest an answer that I'm about 75% confident in. It is a hard question because Douglas does say that it's advantageous for us to have the Constitution on our side, that it's idiotic for Garrison. He kind of says this in the Dred Scott speech in different and better language than I just used, but it's really adverse to our interests here, to allow the other side to have the Constitution. I mean, in other words, it's adverse to our interest to make the anti-slavery revolution contingent on a larger anti-Constitution revolution too. The American people tend to revere the Constitution. Do we really want to be on the wrong side of it? So when you pay attention to stuff like that, if that's all you know, then you get the sense that Douglas's constitutionalism was fashioned to serve a purpose. In my book, I referred to it this way: that the question is whether Douglas reads the Constitution more like a lawyer or more like a judge. Is he interpreting or is he advocating? Now, the case for the other side, I think, is ultimately more compelling. Douglas says, when he gives his own explanation of how this came about, he says, this started to come about when I became a newspaper editor in 1847. When I started editing the North Star, I wanted my paper to be a faithful, organ or venue for the transmission of all variants of anti-slavery views. By that time, the political or constitutional abolitionists and the Garrisonians had split off, and he wanted to give a voice to both those parties. And so he started reading things that constitutional abolitionists published, and he came to the conclusion that they were right. And he gives reasons for it. Some of them are in this Dred Scott speech. Some of them are in a speech. The most extended interpretation of the Constitution he gives is in a speech called The Constitution and Slavery in 1860, which is given in Glasgow, Scotland. But the key thing I think the key fact here is that Douglas had read a book by a cranky Bostonian, a very peculiar character in American history named Lysander Spooner, which had been originally published in 1845, called, what's the slavery? Unconstitutionality of Slavery. That's the title of it. Unconstitutionality of Slavery. And that book is a mouthful. That book is over 300 pages long. It should be about 200 pages. It needed an editor, but Spooner made a whole bunch of arguments, all pointing to the conclusion that the U.S. Constitution was, in fact, a firmly anti-slavery document. Douglas's position on the Constitution, as Lucas was saying, is the most radical way of being an anti-slavery constitutionalist possible. Lincoln was an anti-slavery constitutionalist, but in a more moderate, mainstream kind of way. Douglas's position was that if you read it correctly, the Constitution not only empowers the federal government to abolish slavery in the states, to abolish it instantly and everywhere in the U.S., it not only empowers the federal government to do that, it requires the federal government to do that. It creates not only the right, but the duty. And that's Spooner's title, that slavery is unconstitutional. It could be challenged in court, and a judge would be ruling properly to strike it down, to refuse to enforce this kind of property claim. The reasons for that go into his. Douglas talks a lot about what's the right way of interpreting the Constitution, the proper method of interpretation, what's the right way of reading the things that they did at the convention, an originalist way of interpreting, and those are the things that support his opinion, that it's actually, as he says in the July 4th speech, a glorious liberty document.
Yeah. By the way, Pete, if I can just say, it's worth, you just mentioned this, and it's worth mentioning explicitly. I think that this question really became much more prominent or important in light of the fact that James Madison's debates had just been made public, I believe, in the early 1840s or right around this time, and both Garrison and Douglas would have had access to these things.
Yes.
And it did reveal, but it's amazing how they both came to different conclusions about the intent of the framers from those debates. Garrison concludes clearly this is an anti-slavery. There are anti-slavery motives here, and including these various slave clauses. And Douglas concludes the exact opposite. And I wonder if it's, and I wonder if you mentioned a couple of times the July what to the slave is the 4th of July speech. I wonder if, and that speech was 1851, I believe, right?
52, yeah.
And Douglas comes around at the end, and again rejecting the idea that slaves have to leave, that this can be their country. That attitude seems to be based on a turn, not to say this is the first time Douglas does it, but he really brings the Declaration of Independence in front and center. And I wonder if Douglas begins to interpret the Constitution in light of the Declaration. That is, for Douglas, there's an inseparable connection between the two. And maybe his interpretation, because I think some of his, I'd like to hear your thoughts and Lucas's thoughts on this as well. Some of his more lawyer-like readings of the clauses in the Constitution and his conclusions that those are anti-slavery clauses, I think are a little bit, they're stretched a little bit.
Yeah.
But if you interpret the Constitution in light of the principles of the Declaration, you can be more generous in thinking, in noticing that the Constitution actually does kind of leave it open. It's not necessarily a pro-slavery document. It also includes interpretations that might make it possible for us to take steps against slavery. And that therefore leads him, unlike Garrison, to draw a different conclusion about the intent of the framers. Unlike Garrison and unlike Tawney, right? Judge Tawney. It seems like Garrison essentially ends up agreeing with Judge Tawney's characterization of the intent of the framers, whereas Douglas draws an entirely different conclusion, obviously. So I'm not sure if there's a question in there. I'm just trying to get my thoughts around some of the things you're both raising. The connection of the Declaration to the Constitution seems really important to Douglas's understanding of how to interpret the intent, the original intent behind those particular, again, so-called slave clauses. I call them so-called slave clauses because, as Douglas points out, they never use the word slave or slavery, right? So.
Yeah. I'll just say briefly that Douglas, as much, of course, as he is a fan of the Declaration, I don't know that he leverages the political philosophy explicitly out of the Declaration and into the Constitution as he might have. He really chose to read the Constitution according to the text. And at least his professed claim is, as some originalists would say today, we have to stay within the four corners of the document. Douglas, I think, makes an earnest attempt at doing that, beginning with the preamble. In other words, beginning with what the text itself says it exists to accomplish. And so for him, he says it's not so much a living document in the way that progressives would say today, right? Well, dead white guys might have meant it for X. We, of our generation, mean it for Y. No, Douglas says because it has been misinterpreted and leveraged on behalf of an institution that is inimical, the opposite of why you create republics for so long, it is entirely legitimate for us to put it back on the right track. And that track is a republic is for people. and blacks are people just like whites are people. And if it is intended to bestow the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity, he says the slave power has to come up with an argument as to how slavery can be legitimated by such a constitution, contrary to what its clear intent is, as it itself spells out that intent in the preamble.
That's great. Yeah, that reminds me too of Douglas's analogy of the people have misinterpreted the Bible, right?
Yeah.
But you don't throw the Bible in the fire and say, "To hell with the Bible, it's bad." It's all about a misapplication and a misuse of it for bad ends. And that, by the way, that metaphor always struck me as a jab not only at the slave power but also at perhaps Garrison's own rejection of the Constitution. But Douglas's particular understanding of the slave clauses, it seems to me he gets some of them right in light of the evidence that we have from, again, Madison's debates.
Mm-hmm.
For example, his interpretation of the 3/5 clause, I think, is pretty accurate. Are there other? What do we think of his other interpretations of the slave clauses in particular? Do we have any thoughts on that?
Well,
maybe we don't have enough time. But
that's a question that'll take us. That's a question that'll take us a while to work through. I'll throw out a couple of scattered thoughts on that, but I wanted to comment on your question about the Declaration too. Just to, I guess, say something similar to what Lucas said, but in different words. Because I think the spirit of your question is right, Chris. That I think the Declaration really does inform Douglas's thinking about the Constitution, but it does in an indirect way, and the indirect way is that it does this through the preamble. I think that the Douglas thinks the preamble is a kind of recapitulation of what the Declaration implies about good government and just government, and the preamble is smack in the text, and so it's entirely legitimate to for a textualist, which is what Douglas professed pretty much to be, that to draw that connection. On this point, without getting into too far into Douglas's method of interpretation, about which he's been convinced by Spooner, the crucial principle is this: that, and you could get this from the preamble in a way also, but he gets it. He cites the authority of the U.S. Supreme Court itself in an early and relatively obscure case, and according to which the crucial principle of constitutional interpretation is a presumption in favor of liberty. And Randy Barnett, law professor, famous guy, more famous than Lucas and I are, makes a big deal of this. Presumption in favor of liberty means that, if you have doubtful or ambiguous provisions in the text, then the way to resolve the doubts is to try to understand how the document can be made, 2 points, how the document can be made coherent, not internally self-contradictory. You have to have a presumption in favor of coherence, and you also have to have a presumption in favor of liberty, because you have to, the presumption in favor of liberty can come from the preamble, blessings of liberty for ourselves and our posterity, but it can also come from the nature of law itself. That law is not law, properly speaking, unless it accords with ideas of justice. And so, the presumption in favor of liberty means, simply put, that if it is possible to interpret a given constitutional text in support of liberty, and that would mean against slavery, then it's necessary. If it's possible, it's necessary. And so he would say, I think, in response to the suggestion that, well, some of these readings seem kind of strained, I think he would concede that, that's in a way true, but the straining, as it may seem, is mandated really by this presumption of liberty idea. Another way to say that is to say that if the Constitution's drafters meant to protect slavery, say by the Fugitive Slave Clause or by the other pertinent clauses. Well, then they bungled because they didn't use the word slavery, and so they made it ambiguous, and so they created a license for people to interpret it in an anti-slavery way.
Wow, that was a very clear. I mean, in 2 minutes, Pete, that was perfectly clear explanation of an extraordinarily difficult idea.
I seldom achieve clarity, so I'm pleased. I'm pleased with that comment.
I mean, again, but it raises another question: though, why did Garrison not? I don't know that we can answer this in 2 minutes, but actually we're out of time. But why did Garrison not start with that assumption that this is a document that presumes or built on the presumption of liberty? Again, maybe it's a little unfair.
Yeah, well, to be fair to Garrison, maybe one can say, well, no, I can't quite say this. I was going to say, one could maybe say he was convinced by Wendell Phillips, but he held his position long before Wendell Phillips wrote. Just for the interest of the teachers, though, by the way, that if you want the two sides of this contention in the 1840s through about 1860, read Spooner on the one side, and you get the elaborate version of the argument Douglas makes, and read Wendell Phillips on the other side, who writes a small book, The Constitution, a pro-slavery document, pro-slavery compact, I think, or something like that, and Phillips regarded as conclusive the appearance of Madison's notes in 1840. He thought Madison's notes, when you dug into those, made it clear that when they were mentioning persons, they were talking about slaves, and that when they were, and so forth. So I'll not go on about that.
That's great. Yeah, very, very interesting. And unfortunately, I mean, I think we need another hour to keep going on this. I'd love to ask both of you how Garrison and Douglas disagreed with regard to Lincoln's actions as president, but we'll have to have that conversation another time.
That would be a good one.
Yeah, it would. Maybe we'll do that again sometime. But I don't want to keep you both over. I know you're both very busy, but I do greatly appreciate your time and your thoughts. I've learned a great deal.
This is excellent.
As always. So thank you both very much. And I wish we could get to a few more questions as well, but.
On that subject, can I say one last thing? I don't know if this is consistent with Ashwin's needs, so I may be presumptuous here. But Julia, hello, first of all, and we didn't get to your question, but stick around, and if you want to talk about it, if it's possible for anybody to stick around, I'd be interested to talk about that question too, as well as just to say hello. So that for what that's worth.
Yeah, unfortunately, I have another appointment on my own Saturday. That's somewhere else. But this was awesome. Even though I teach this subject, I always learn when I listen to Pete. So this is really good.
Likewise, always fun, Lucas.
About the chapter of that new book, The Political Philosophy of the Civil War, where you got a chapter in there that is just first rate on Frederick Douglass.
Well, you are you're kind to say that. But
on that point, can I mention recommend a couple of good books from both of these gentlemen for our people joining us if you're interested. Can't recommend enough Lucas's book, Lincoln's Sacred Effort, Defining Religion's Role in American Self-Government. And Lucas also edited a collection of essays called Lincoln and Liberty, Wisdom for the Ages. And Pete Myers, your book on Fred Douglass, Race and the Rebirth of American Liberalism.
Best book on Frederick Douglass ever written.
I would agree. I agree entirely, right? And also a book that had an influence on me, your book on Locke, called Our Only Star and Compass. So recommend the writings of these guys for further thought. Thanks to both of you again. Thanks to our participants for some great questions. I forgot to mention this before. If you're joining us, you'll get an email with a link in it by which you can request a certificate of participation. We'll also post the audio and video from today's webinar soon, and you'll get a link to that as well. Our next Saturday webinar will be on Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas, and that will be December 1st with Dan Monroe of Millikan University and Jason Stevens of Ashland University. So thanks again. Look forward to seeing you at our next Saturday webinar in a few weeks.
Thanks, guys.
Yep. Thank you. Yeah, and you all should